At my brother Edward's funeral, his lawyer pulled me aside and whispered, "Edward left you this envelope, read it alone." Then he added, "And do not tell your son or his wife, Veronica. Your brother said you could be in danger." When I opened it and saw what was inside, I realized my brother had been murdered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The rain was pouring down on the black umbrellas like a relentless drumbeat matching the pounding in my chest. I stood there staring at the mahogany casket that held my brother Edward, the only decent man left in the Carter bloodline. To my right, my daughter-in-law, Veronica, was putting on a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She wailed loudly, clutching a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes, while her body shook with fake sobs. But I saw what others missed. Every 30 seconds, she stopped crying, just long enough to glance at the $12,000 Cartier watch on her wrist. She was not checking the time out of grief, she was timing how much longer she had to pretend before she could get her hands on Edward's $18 million estate. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned expecting comfort from my only son, Brandon. Instead, I saw beads of cold sweat on his forehead, despite the chilly Seattle weather. He did not hug me. He did not ask how I was holding up. His eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in close and whispered, "Dad, did Uncle Edward give you the master keys to the safe deposit box before he died?" I looked at him in disbelief. My brother was being lowered into the ground 6 feet away, and my son was asking about keys. I pulled away from him, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Brandon, your uncle just died. Show some respect." Brandon grabbed my arm, his grip desperate and painful. "You do not understand." "Dad, I need to know if there is cash in the house. Veronica says we can sell the art collection next week, but I need access now. The creditors are calling." I stared at him, realizing the boy I raised had become a desperate stranger drowning in debt. I brushed his hand off my coat and stepped away. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse toward their luxury cars, a shadow emerged from behind a large marble angel. It was Mr. Hastings Edwards' personal attorney for 40 years, a man who never smiled and never lied. He signaled for me to follow him behind a row of hedges, away from the prying eyes of my son and daughter-in-law. Hastings looked around to ensure we were alone, then reached into his trench coat and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. His hands, usually steady as a rock, were shaking slightly. "Take this, Bill," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Edward gave this to me 3 days ago. He made me swear to give it to you only after he was in the ground." I reached for the envelope, feeling the weight of it. "What is it?" I asked. Hastings gripped my shoulder tight. "It is the truth, Bill, and whatever you do, do not let Veronica see it. Edward suspected they were poisoning him." I stepped inside my cramped one-bedroom apartment and threw the bolt lock. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the sound of the Seattle rain still hammering against the thin window pane. My hands were shaking as I placed the envelope on the scarred wooden table. It felt like I was holding a bonbon. I tore the seal. Inside there was a key to a bank safety deposit box and a letter written on yellow legal pad paper. The handwriting was jagged and erratic, nothing like the precise architectural script my brother Edward was famous for. It looked like the writing of a man who was terrified. "Bill, if you are reading this, I am already dead. Do not believe the autopsy. Do not believe the heart attack story. They are killing me, Bill." Slowly. "Veronica and that doctor she hired, Ellis. They are forcing me to take digoxin. They tell me it is for my arrhythmia, but I checked the dosage on the bottle when the nurse was not looking. It is 3 times the lethal limit. They are stopping my heart on purpose." I had to sit down on my rickety chair. My knees gave out. Digoxin. I knew that drug. It was used for heart failure, but in high doses it induced cardiac arrest. They had murdered him in plain sight in his own home. I forced myself to keep reading, my eyes blurring with tears of rage. They are doing this for the money, but they do not know the half of it. Brandon thinks the estate is worth $2 million. He is an idiot who never paid attention to my investments. Bill, the real value of the portfolio is $18.5 million. I moved the liquid assets into a blind trust last week. You are the sole trustee. Do not let them find this letter. If they know you have the power to cut them off, they will kill you too. $18.5 million. The number echoed in my head. My brother was not just rich, he was a tycoon. And my son and his wife had killed him for a fraction of what he was actually worth. A cold fury replaced the grief in my chest. They thought they were inheriting a fortune, but they were walking into a trap Edward had set from the grave. I folded the letter and shoved it into the hollow leg of my kitchen table, a hiding spot I had used since I returned from Vietnam. Just as I stood up, a thunderous crash shook the front door. Dust fell from the ceiling frame. "Open up, Dad, we know you are in there." It was Brandon. His voice was not sad or mourning. It was aggressive and impatient. I barely had time to step back before the lock splintered. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a sickening crack. Brandon stood there flanked by Veronica and two massive men in blue coveralls who looked more like prison guards than movers. Veronica stepped over the threshold, her high heels clicking on my linoleum floor like gunshots. She looked around my small home with a sneer of absolute disgust, flicking a piece of peeling paint off her designer coat. "Pack your things, William," she said, not even bothering to call me Dad anymore. "This building is being condemned by the city tomorrow. You are coming with us. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack what you can carry. William." Veronica announced, checking her $12,000 watch, as if she were timing a boiling egg. "The demolition crew is scheduled for 6 a.m. sharp. My husband is company now acting CEO. Brandon here acquired this dilapidated building last week, and we are leveling it for a new luxury condo complex." I looked at my son, who was pretending to study the cracks in my ceiling. "Brandon, you bought the building I live in just to kick me out." "It is a strategic acquisition, Dad." Brandon mumbled, still refusing to meet my eyes. "It is just business." "Business," I shouted, my voice echoing in the small apartment. "I have tenant rights, Brandon. I have lived here for 10 years. I reached for the landline on the wall. "I am calling the police. You cannot evict a 72-year-old veteran without a court order and a 30-day notice. This is illegal." Veronica laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a crisp, legal document, slamming it onto my kitchen table next to my brother's death letter, which I had just hidden. "Actually, we can, William. Especially when the tenant is in breach of contract for non-payment of rent." My jaw dropped. "That is a lie. I have never missed a payment in my life. My pension checks are set to auto-draft on the 1st of every month." "Not for the last 90 days, Veronica smirked, tapping a long, manicured fingernail on the paper. "Check your statements. Your account has been frozen due to suspicious activity. 3 months of arrears breaks your lease clause immediately. The eviction is effective as of this morning." I looked at Brandon, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. Last month, he had come over to help me fix my iPad. He had asked for my banking passwords to set up a new security feature. He had not secured my account, he had sabotaged it. He had deliberately blocked the transfers to frame his own father. "You set me up," I whispered, my hands curling into fists. "You stole my rent money to justify throwing me onto the street." "We are not throwing you onto the street, William," Veronica said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We are taking you in. You are coming to live at Edward's estate with us. We are family after all." Before I could protest, Veronica snapped her fingers at the two large men standing by the door. "Get him in the car." They moved instantly. One grabbed my arm with a grip that bruised while the other started sweeping my belongings. My military medals, my wife's photo frame, my clothes into a black trash bag like they were garbage. Hey, let go of me. I struggled, but at 72 I was no match for two hired thugs. They dragged me out of my home past my neighbors, who peeked through their curtains too scared to intervene. I was shoved into the back seat of a black SUV with tinted windows. The child locks clicked shut instantly. Brandon got into the driver's seat. Veronica sat in the passenger side, checking her makeup in the mirror. I sat in the back, clutching the trash bag that contained my entire life. As the car sped away through the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, I felt the key to Edward's safety deposit box burning a hole in my pocket. We drove in silence up the winding hill to my brother's estate. Through the rain, the massive iron gates loomed like the entrance to a fortress. As we passed through and the heavy metal bars clanged shut behind us, I realized the terrifying truth. This was not a rescue mission. They were not taking me in to care for me. They were bringing me here to watch me. I was walking straight into the same slaughterhouse where my brother had died, and I was the next animal in line. The massive iron gates of my brother Edward, his estate slammed shut behind us, with a finality that made my blood run cold. This place used to be a sanctuary, filled with the smell of Maria's fresh baking and the sound of classical music. Now it felt like a maximum security facility. I looked around for Maria, the housekeeper, who had served our family faithfully for 20 years, hoping to see a friendly face. She was gone. In her place stood three men with buzz cuts and earpieces wearing tight black t-shirts that barely concealed the holsters at their waists. They looked like mercenaries, not house staff. "Where is Maria?" I asked, as I was shoved through the grand foyer. Veronica did not even turn around. "She fired everyone an hour after Edward died," she said casually, kicking off her heels onto the antique Persian rug. "We are modernizing the staff. These gentlemen are from Titan Security. They are here to ensure our privacy and to make sure no one wanders off." She glanced at me with a look that made it clear who she meant by no one. Brandon was already hauling his suitcases up the marble staircase towards the master wing. I started to follow him, assuming I would stay in the guest room I had used for decades. Veronica blocked my path with a manicured hand. "Not that way, William," she sneered, pointing a finger toward the kitchen. "The upstairs is restricted. Brandon and I are taking the master suite. We need the space for the nursery renovation. You will be staying in the service quarters." I stared at her. The service quarters were a polite name for the 6-by-8-foot room behind the pantry where the live-in maid used to sleep. "You are putting me in the maid's room in my own brother's house while you sleep in his bed." "It is cozy," Veronica smiled cruelly. "Plus it is closer to the back door in case you need to get some fresh air. Just do not try to leave the grounds. The security system is very sensitive." I gripped the trash bag containing my worldly possessions and walked past the dining room table where my brother used to host charity dinners for senators and CEOs. That was when I saw it. Sitting casually on the polished mahogany surface next to a stack of unpaid bills was a small orange prescription bottle. My heart hammered against my ribs. I recognized the label instantly, even from 5 feet away. Digoxin. It was the same bottle Edward had described in his letter. The bottle they used to stop his heart was still sitting there like a trophy. They were not just keeping me prisoner. They were keeping me in the crime scene. The dining room in my brother's estate was built to seat 20 people, but tonight it felt like an interrogation cell. The crystal chandelier above us cast long, cold shadows against the walls. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table while Brandon and Veronica sat together at the head, whispering to each other like conspirators. The staff was gone. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I kept my hands folded in my lap to hide the fact that I was clenching my fists so hard my knuckles were white. I knew I was in the lion's den, but I had to play the part of the confused, helpless old man. "Dinner is served," Veronica announced, her voice singing with a cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. She stood up and walked to the sideboard where a silver tureen of lobster bisque was waiting. Usually she would never lower herself to serve food, but tonight she insisted on doing it herself. She ladled soup into 2 bowls for her, and Brandon then filled a 3rd bowl. I watched her hand. It lingered over the 3rd bowl for a fraction of a second too long. A quick, subtle movement, like a magician performing a sleight of hand. "Here you go," she said, placing the steaming porcelain bowl directly in front of me. "Eat up. You need your strength, especially at your age." I looked down at the soup. To anyone else, it looked like ordinary lobster bisque, creamy and pink. But I spent 40 years as a structural engineer. My entire career was built on noticing the smallest details, the hairline cracks in concrete, the slight discoloration in metal that signaled fatigue. I narrowed my eyes. The soup in my bowl had a slightly different viscosity than theirs. There was a faint, almost imperceptible milky film resting on the surface, and the steam rising from it did not smell just like seafood. It smelled bitter like almonds and chemicals. My heart began to race. It was the digoxin. They were not waiting. They were trying to overdose me on my very first night. If I ate this, I would be dead before dessert, and they would call it a tragic heart attack brought on by the stress of the eviction. But if I refused to eat, they would know that I was onto them. I looked up at Veronica. She was watching me intently, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. Her eyes were predatory, waiting for me to take that first spoon. "Thank you, Veronica," I said, my voice trembling with a feigned weakness. I picked up my spoon. My hand started to shake. I exaggerated the tremor, letting my arm jerk spastically. "Careful, Dad," Brandon said, but he did not move to help. I lifted the spoon halfway, then let my arm spasm violently to the right. The heavy porcelain bowl went flying. It flipped over in the air and landed squarely in Veronica's lap. Hot, thick soup exploded everywhere, soaking her white silk dress and splashing onto her chest. "You stupid old fool!" she screamed, jumping up and knocking her chair back. The scalding liquid was dripping down her expensive designer outfit onto the rug. "Oh, I am so sorry," I stammered, shrinking back in my chair, playing the part of the terrified invalid. My hand, it just slipped. Veronica's face was twisted in a mask of pure hatred. She looked ready to pick up the steak knife and finish me off right there. But before she could lunge at me, Brandon grabbed her arm and pulled her forcefully toward the kitchen to get towels. They thought I was deaf or too senile to hear, but my hearing was the one thing age had not taken from me. Through the swinging kitchen door, I heard Brandon hiss at her. "Are you crazy, Veronica? I saw how much powder you put in that bowl. That was 10 times the normal dose. He would have died right there at the table while we were eating." "Let him die," Veronica snapped back. "It saves us the trouble of waiting." "No," Brandon argued, his voice shaking with panic. "We need it to look natural in his sleep, not foaming at the mouth during dinner. We have to be smart about this." I sat alone in the dining room, staring at the empty spot where my poisoned bowl had been. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady. I had bought myself one night, but I knew that tomorrow there would be no mistakes. I had to move fast. The digital clock on the nightstand of the cramped servants' quarters read 2:14 in the morning. I lay perfectly still in the narrow twin bed, my breathing shallow and rhythmic, mimicking the deep sleep of the elderly. My body ached from the tension of the day, but my mind was razor sharp. I knew there were cameras in the hallways, but Edward had mentioned in his letter that the service corridor near the kitchen had a blind spot, a flaw in the design he had meant to fix but never got around to. That flaw was my only lifeline now. I waited until I was certain the house was silent. Slowly, I pushed back the thin blanket and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My knees popped quietly, a reminder of my age, but I moved with the muscle memory of a man who had survived the jungles of Vietnam. I did not put on my shoes. Socks were quieter on the hardwood floors. I cracked the door open an inch. The hallway was pitch black save for a sliver of yellow light spilling from the kitchen doorway at the far end of the corridor. I crept forward, pressing my back against the cold plaster wall, counting my steps. As I got closer, I heard a voice. It was low and urgent. It was Veronica. She was not asleep in the master suite with my son. She was downstairs, plotting. I stopped just outside the doorframe, straining to hear. "I do not care about the risks, Ellis," she hissed. Her voice lacked the sugary sweetness she used when Brandon was around. This was the real Veronica, cold and transactional. Just increase the dosage. The old man is tougher than Edward was. That stunt with the soup tonight set us back. I felt a chill run down my spine. She was talking to Dr. Ellis, the man who had signed my brother's death certificate. "You promised me this would be over by Friday," she continued, her voice rising in agitation. "I put a $20,000 non-refundable deposit on that Porsche 911 Turbo S this morning. The dealer said if I do not wire the remaining $140,000 by the weekend, they sell it to someone else. I am not losing that car, Ellis." I clamped a hand over my mouth to stop a gasp. My life, my brother's legacy, and the entire Carter estate were being weighed against a luxury sports car. She was willing to kill 2 men just to drive a status symbol. "Figure it out," she snapped. "Or I will find a doctor who has more guts and less scruples. And Ellis, remember, I have the emails. If I go down, you go down." I leaned in closer, trying to hear the doctor's response on the other end. But I shifted my weight too much. The old floorboard beneath my left foot let out a long, groaning creak. In the silence of the night, it sounded like a gunshot. Veronica stopped talking mid-sentence. There was a terrifying pause. "Hold on," she whispered. I heard the distinct sound of a drawer sliding open and the metallic scrape of steel against wood. She was grabbing a knife from the butcher block. This was not a woman checking for a burglar. This was a killer clearing a perimeter. "Who is there?" she called out. Her voice was steady, dangerous. Panic surged through me. I could not run back to my room in time. She would see me. I looked around frantically. To my right, in a decorative alcove, stood a 5-foot bronze statue of Atlas holding up the world. It was my only chance. I threw myself behind the heavy marble pedestal, squeezing my body into the dark corner, just as Veronica stepped into the hallway. Through the gap between the statue and the wall, I saw her. She was wearing a silk robe, and in her right hand she gripped a 6-inch paring knife. The blade caught the kitchen light. She walked slowly past my hiding spot. I held my breath, my lungs burning. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, her head cocked to the side like a predator hunting in the tall grass. If she took one step closer, she would see my shadow. If she looked down, she would see my reflection in the polished floor. I gripped the back of the statue, preparing to fight for my life, with nothing but my bare hands. The next morning, I put on my best performance of a senile old man. I shuffled into the kitchen, wearing my pajamas inside out, intentionally dragging my feet across the expensive Italian marble floor. I let my mouth hang open slightly and stared blankly at the refrigerator, as if I had forgotten what it was. Brandon and Veronica were already sitting at the island. The air smelled of expensive espresso and greed. "Good morning, Martha," I mumbled, looking directly at Veronica. I deliberately called her by my late wife's name. Veronica rolled her eyes so hard I thought they would get stuck. "Oh, God. Brandon, he is getting worse. He thinks I am your dead mother." She turned back to her phone, ignoring me completely, as if I were a piece of furniture that had seen better days. I sat down at the far end of the island and watched. They were so convinced of my mental decline that they did not even bother to lower their voices. "The auction house rep will be here at noon," Veronica said, tapping on her tablet. "I told him we want a quick sale on the entire art collection. He said he can get us $500,000 for the 19th century landscapes alone if we bundle them." Brandon looked nervous, his hand shaking as he held a coffee cup. "Are you sure, Veronica? Uncle Edward's will has not even been probated yet. If the executor finds out we are selling assets before the legal transfer, we could go to jail for fraud." Veronica slammed her hand down on the counter, making me jump. Stop being such a coward. We need cash today, Brandon. That 500,000 is just a drop in the bucket compared to what we owe. Just sign the papers for the commercial lot. The developer is waiting. My ears perked up. The commercial lot. Edward owned a prime piece of real estate downtown that was zoned for a skyscraper. It was worth millions. Brandon pulled a thick stack of documents out of his briefcase. I squinted my eyes. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the property to a shell company I had never heard of for $1. They were laundering the asset. I watched Brandon uncapping his fountain pen. The tip hovered over the signature line. If he signed that the land would be gone forever, sold for pennies to cover their debts. I needed that document. It was the physical proof of fraud I needed to show Hastings. I stand up shakily, my hand reaching for the pitcher of orange juice near Brandon, his elbow. "Juice," I croaked. "I want juice." "Sit down, Dad." "I will get it," Brandon snapped, not looking up. I lunged forward, pretending to lose my balance. My arm swept across the counter, knocking the heavy glass pitcher directly onto Brandon's lap. Cold, sticky juice exploded everywhere, soaking his suit pants and the expensive rug. "Damn it, old man," Brandon screamed, jumping up. While Brandon was cursing and wiping his pants and Veronica was screaming for a towel, their eyes were off the table. In that split second of chaos, I reached out with a speed that defied my age. I snatched the unsigned deed from the pile and shoved it deep into the pocket of my pajama pants. "I am sorry," I wailed, playing the part perfectly. "I just wanted juice." "Get him out of here!" Veronica shrieked, pointing at me with a juice-stained finger. "Lock him in his room before he destroys anything else." As Brandon dragged me back toward the servant quarters, I kept my head down to hide the triumphant smirk on my face. I had the paper. Now I just needed to get it out of the house. The opportunity arrived at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Veronica had taken the Bentley to the Diamond Spa downtown for a $600 facial and a seaweed wrap, leaving the house quiet for the first time in days. Brandon was supposedly working in the living room, but when I walked past, I saw him sprawled out on the leather sofa with a half-empty bottle of scotch on the floor, snoring loud enough to shake the windows. The stress of his gambling debts was clearly taking its toll, and alcohol was his only coping mechanism. I moved quickly to the east wing of the house toward Edward's private study. The door was made of solid oak and looked impenetrable. Veronica had placed a heavy-duty padlock on the latch, a crude addition to such an elegant room, but it showed just how desperate they were to keep me out. They did not know that before I was a structural engineer, I worked construction in Detroit. We lost keys all the time. I pulled a stiff wire paperclip from my pocket and straightened it out. My hands were 72 years old and stiff with arthritis, but my mind knew exactly how the tumblers inside a cheap lock worked. I inserted the wire, applying just the right amount of torque. 10 seconds. That was all it took. The lock clicked open with a satisfying snap. I removed it carefully, setting it on the floor so it would not make a sound. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. The air in the study was stale, smelling of old leather and the expensive Cuban cigars Edward used to smoke before his heart condition worsened. The room had been tossed. Drawers were pulled out, papers were scattered on the floor, and books had been swept off the shelves. They had torn this place apart looking for the liquid assets. But they did not know my brother like I did. Edward was a man of patterns. I walked straight to the large oil painting of the Seattle skyline hanging above the fireplace. In his letter, Edward had written, "Look behind the city we built together." It was a reference to our first big construction project in 1982. I gripped the heavy gold frame and pulled. It swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a steel wall safe embedded in the brickwork. It was a Titan II model, fireproof and drill-resistant. I pulled the key Edward had mailed me from my sock. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. If Brandon woke up, if Veronica came home early, I was dead. I inserted the key and typed in the code. 1972, the year our mother passed away. The light on the keypad turned green. I pulled the heavy steel handle, and the door hissed open. I was expecting to see stacks of cash-bearer bonds or the deed to the summer house in the Hamptons. My stomach dropped. The safe was empty. I stared into the dark metal void. Panic rose in my throat. Had they found it? Had Veronica tortured the code out of Edward before she killed him? I reached my hand inside, feeling around the cold metal interior, hoping to find anything they might have missed. My fingertips brushed against something small and thin stuck to the very back wall of the safe. I peeled it off. It was not money. It was a small cream-colored business card. I held it up to the light. It read, Blackwood Private Investigations. There was a phone number and a handwritten note on the back in Edward's shaky script. It said simply, if I die, do not call the police. Call him. He has the files. I realized then that Edward had been playing a much longer game than any of us knew. He knew he was dying, and he had outsourced the evidence gathering to a professional. The safe was not a bank. It was a signpost. Suddenly I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway outside. The snoring in the living room had stopped. Brandon was awake. I shoved the business card into my shoe and pushed the painting back against the wall, just as the doorknob began to turn. I told the Titan security guard at the front gate that my heart palpitations were acting up, and I needed a walk in the fresh air to calm down. It was a flimsy excuse, but the guard looked at me with pity, seeing only a frail old man in oversized pajamas, and waved me through. As soon as I turned the corner and was out of sight of the cameras, I flagged down a taxi. My hands were trembling not from age, but from adrenaline. I gave the driver the address on the business card I had found in the safe. The taxi dropped me off in the industrial district of Seattle, a place smelling of diesel and neglect. The building was a crumbling brick structure with a flickering neon sign that read, Blackwood Investigations. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knocked 3 times on the frosted glass door. The door cracked open, revealing a man with bloodshot eyes and a Glock 19 tucked into the waistband of his jeans. It was Blackwood. He looked like he had not slept in a week. When he saw me, his face went pale. "You," he hissed. "You are William Carter. Go away. I do not want any part of this." He tried to slam the door, but I jammed my foot in the gap, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," I said, pushing my way inside. "My brother told me to trust you." "Trust me," Blackwood laughed bitterly, backing away. He was packing a suitcase on his desk, throwing files into a shredder. "Trust is what got your brother killed. Edward hired me to look into his wife's financial dealings. What I found was not just fraud, William. It was a death sentence. Veronica knows I have the evidence. Her goons have been parked outside my house for 2 days. I am leaving town tonight." He moved to shove past me. I grabbed his arm. "I cannot let them get away with this. They poisoned him. That is not my problem anymore," Blackwood snapped, shaking me off. "I am not dying for a client who is already 6 feet under. Get out before you lead them right to me." I stood there desperate. I had no cash. My bank accounts were frozen by my son. I had nothing to offer a man who was running for his life except one thing. I pulled the heavy gold signet ring off my finger. It was an heirloom passed down from my grandfather, a ring I had worn every day for 50 years. "This is solid gold, 18 carats," I said, holding it out. "It was appraised at $8,500 last year. It is yours. Just give me the file." Blackwood stopped. He looked at the ring, then at my desperate eyes. The greed and fear warred on his face. Finally, he snatched the ring from my hand and shoved it into his pocket. "Fine," he grunted. He walked over to a rusted radiator in the corner of the room. He reached behind it and pulled loose a piece of duct tape attached to a small black USB drive. He pressed it into my hand, his grip tight. "This is everything," he whispered. The bank transfers the emails with Dr. Ellis and the purchase orders for the arsenic. But listen to me, old man. This is not just evidence. It is a target on your back. Edward died to protect what is on this drive. If Veronica sees this, she will not hesitate to put you in the ground next to him. Now get out, Blackwood said, grabbing his suitcase. And if anyone asks, you never saw me. I walked back out into the rain, clutching the small piece of plastic that held the weight of my brother's life. I had the weapon I needed, but as I stepped onto the street, I realized the hard part was just beginning. I had to get this back into the house without being searched. I ducked into a small rundown internet cafe on 4th Avenue sandwiched between a pawn shop and a liquor store. It was a dingy place smelling of stale coffee and ozone, but it was anonymous, and that was exactly what I needed. I paid cash for 30 minutes of computer time to a teenager behind the counter who barely looked up from his phone. My hands were trembling as I sat down at the terminal in the back corner. I plugged in the small black USB drive Detective Blackwood had given me. The drive appeared on the screen, labeled simply Justice. I clicked on the first folder named Medical History. It was a scanned report from a cardiologist dated just 2 days before Edward died. I read the summary 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. Patient exhibits excellent cardiac health for his age. No signs of arrhythmia. No heart failure. My breath hitched in my throat. The digoxin prescription was not treating a disease, it was creating one. Dr. Ellis had not misdiagnosed my brother, he had falsified a condition to justify the poison. Edward was perfectly healthy until they started treating him. I opened the next file, hoping to find bank transfers, but what I found was far more chilling. It was a digital receipt from an industrial chemical supply company in Oregon. It was for 2 pounds of industrial-grade arsenic. The date on the invoice was 3 weeks ago. The buyer was listed as a shell corporation, but the delivery address was a P.O. box I recognized instantly. It was the same box Veronica used for her online shopping deliveries to hide her spending from Edward. The receipt was signed with an alias V. Stone. Stone was her maiden name. I felt sick to my stomach. This was not just a crime of passion or opportunity. This was calculated, cold-blooded slaughter. They had a primary plan with the heart medication and a backup plan with the arsenic in case the heart attack did not look convincing enough. She had bought enough poison to kill an army. I quickly emailed the files to a secure encrypted account I had set up years ago. I was not going to let this physical drive be the only copy of the truth. Just as I ejected the USB, my phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. It was Brandon. I stared at the screen for a second. If I did not answer, they would come looking for me. I took a deep breath and slid the answer button. Dad. Where the hell are you? Brandon screamed into the phone. He sounded breathless, terrified, like a man with a gun to his head. You have been gone for 2 hours. Veronica is losing her mind. She thinks you went to the police. I forced my voice to sound weak and confused, playing the part of the senile old man one more time. I am sorry, son. I got a little lost. The streets all look the same in the rain. I am just at a coffee shop trying to remember the way back. Get back here now, Brandon hissed, his voice dropping to a panic-stricken whisper. She is tearing the house apart looking for something. She is screaming about missing documents. She says if you are not back in 20 minutes, she is calling the mental health services to have you committed tonight. Do not test her, Dad. Just come home before she does something crazy. I hung up the phone. I knew exactly what documents she was looking for. The deed I stole from the kitchen and the files I now had in my pocket. I had to go back into the lion's den, but this time I was not a victim. I was a hunter with ammunition. I flagged down a yellow taxi on 4th Avenue, my heart still racing from what I had just discovered. I told the driver to take me to a drop-off point half a mile from the estate, intending to walk the rest of the way through the woods to avoid the front gate cameras. I sat low in the back seat, watching the rain streak against the window, clutching the small USB drive in my pocket, so tight my knuckles turned white. It was just a piece of plastic, but it contained the proof that my brother was murdered in cold blood. We merged onto the wet highway, and I instinctively checked the side mirror. A habit from my days in the service. A black pickup truck with tinted windows was following us. It was not just behind us, it was hunting us. The truck accelerated aggressively, its high beams blinding the taxi driver. "Hey buddy, watch it!" the driver yelled, waving his hand at the rearview mirror. "He is not going to stop," I shouted. "Drive faster!" Before the driver could react, the truck surged forward with a roar of a modified engine. The heavy steel bumper slammed into the rear of our sedan with the force of a freight train. Metal crunched and glass shattered. The taxi spun out of control, hydroplaning across the slick asphalt. The world became a blur of spinning lights and screaming tires. We slammed into the concrete guardrail with a bone-jarring impact. The airbags deployed, instantly filling the cabin with white dust and the smell of burnt explosives. I groaned, my vision swimming. My shoulder throbbed where it had hit the door. Beside me, the driver was slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He was breathing, but unconscious. I tried to unbuckle my seatbelt, but my fingers were numb. Through the shattered window, I saw a pair of heavy combat boots stepping out of the black truck. A man walked toward the wreckage. He was not checking for survivors. He was moving with a menacing purpose. He wore a dark raincoat and a mask covering the lower half of his face. He ripped the back door of the taxi open. The cold rain blew in, hitting my face. He leaned in close, his eyes dead and cold. "First warning, old man," he whispered. His voice was gravelly, like he smoked a pack a day. "Hand over the USB drive. We know you have it." My hand went to my pocket. I felt the drive. It was one of those nano drives barely the size of a fingernail. If I gave it to him, Veronica would win. She would get away with murder, and I would be next. If I kept it, he would kill me right here on the side of the road. I made a choice. I pulled the drive out, but instead of handing it to him, I brought my hand to my mouth. I threw the tiny piece of plastic to the back of my throat and swallowed hard. It scratched my esophagus, going down a dry, painful lump that tasted of metal and victory. I opened my empty mouth and showed him. "Come and get it," I wheezed. The man raised his fist to strike me, but sirens began to wail in the distance. Blue and red lights flashed against the wet pavement. He cursed violently, slamming the taxi door shut. "This is not over," he hissed before running back to his truck. As the paramedics pulled me out of the wreckage moments later, clutching my chest, I realized two things. I was alive, and I was now a walking vault, holding the only evidence that could bring my family down inside my own stomach. The sterile smell of ammonia burned my nostrils as I regained consciousness. My head felt like it had been split open with an axe, and my left arm was plastered to my side in a heavy cast. I tried to sit up, but leather restraints bound my wrists to the metal rails of the hospital bed. I was not a patient. I was a prisoner. Standing over me, adjusting the drip on my IV bag, was not a nurse. It was Dr. Ellis, the man whose signature was on my brother Edward's fake autopsy report. He smiled when he saw my eyes open, a cold, clinical smile that did not reach his eyes. "You took quite a hit out there, William," he said, checking my pulse with icy fingers. "A severe concussion, 2 fractured ribs, and a dislocated shoulder. You are lucky to be alive. Or perhaps unlucky, depending on how you look at it." I struggled against the restraints, my heart rate monitor beeping faster. "Where is the police?" I demanded, my voice raspy. "I was run off the road. It was attempted murder." Dr. Ellis chuckled, reaching into the pocket of his white lab coat. He pulled out a syringe filled with a cloudy yellow liquid. "There was no police report, William. Veronica told the responding officers, you have a history of dementia and wandering off. She said you stole a taxi and crashed it in a confused state. You are in the private psychiatric wing now. No visitors allowed." He flicked the needle to clear the air bubbles. "This will help you sleep. Permanently, if we are lucky." He moved toward my IV line. I knew that liquid. It was a sedative strong enough to stop the heart of a 72-year-old man already in shock. He thought I was helpless, bound, and broken. But he forgot that before I was an engineer, I was a soldier, and I knew how to wait for an opening. As Ellis leaned over me to inject the port on my left arm, I stopped struggling. I went completely limp. He relaxed, thinking I had given up. That was his mistake. With a surge of adrenaline that masked the screaming pain in my broken ribs, I twisted my right wrist. The leather restraint was old and loose. I ripped my hand free, snapping the buckle. Before Ellis could react, I grabbed his wrist with a grip of steel. His eyes went wide with shock. I did not push him away. I pulled him down. I jammed his own hand downward, driving the needle straight into his upper thigh. He howled in agony, dropping the syringe and stumbling back. He crashed into the instrument tray, sending metal tools clattering across the floor. He clawed at his leg, cursing vilely. Suddenly, the door to my room swung open. I expected security. Instead, it was Veronica. She stood in the doorway looking impeccable in a red designer dress, holding a clutch that cost more than my annual pension. She looked at the doctor writhing on the floor, then at me panting in the bed. She did not scream. She did not call for help. She started to clap. A slow, sarcastic applause. "Very impressive, William," she said, stepping over the groaning doctor. "You really are a stubborn old goat." She walked to the side of my bed and leaned in close. Her perfume was overpowering, sickeningly sweet. "But you do not seem to understand the gravity of your situation. I paid the hospital administrator $50,000 this morning to keep this floor off the records. You are not a patient here, William. You are a ghost, and ghosts do not walk out the front door." She patted my cheek gently. "Get comfortable. You are going to die in this room just like your brother died in his, and this time there will be no autopsy." Veronica's smile faded instantly the moment the heavy hospital door swung open, and Mr. Hastings marched in flanked by 2 private security contractors who looked even bigger than the ones Veronica had hired. I had managed to hit the emergency panic button on the bedside remote repeatedly before she entered, triggering a generic alarm. But Hastings' arrival was pure timing. He had been tracking my phone and saw the location go dark at the crash site. "Get away from my client!" Hastings barked, his voice echoing off the sterile tile walls. Veronica immediately switched masks. "Oh, thank God you are here, Mr. Hastings," she said, clutching her pearls, her voice trembling with fake concern. "Dad is having a psychotic break. The accident caused a brain bleed. He just attacked poor Dr. Ellis with a needle. We need to sedate him for his own safety." Hastings did not even look at her. He looked at the doctor, who was still on the floor, clutching his bleeding thigh, and then at me. I was bruised, battered, and bound, but I nodded once. That was all the signal he needed. "Get him up." Hastings ordered his men. "We are leaving. Immediately." Veronica stepped in front of the gurney, blocking the exit. Her eyes flashed with panic. "You cannot take him. He is in critical condition. Moving him is against medical advice. As his next of kin, I have medical power of attorney. I am forbidding this discharge." Hastings stepped close to her, invading her personal space. He pulled a folded document from his breast pocket. "Actually, Veronica, you do not. Edward granted William full autonomy in his living will, and I represent William. Furthermore, if you do not step aside in the next 5 seconds, I will have this hospital surrounded by police. I will file charges for false imprisonment, kidnapping, and attempted murder. And Dr. Ellis." Hastings looked down at the sweating doctor. "I will have your medical license revoked and framed on my wall before dinner." The room went deadly silent. Dr. Ellis, pale and bleeding, shook his head at Veronica. He was done. "Fine," Veronica hissed, stepping aside. Her face was twisted in ugly defeat. "Take him. But remember, his apartment is condemned. He has nowhere to go. He has to come back to the estate." That was the trap, I knew it. She wanted me back in the house where she could control the environment. If I went back as a fighter, she would find another way to kill me. I needed a disguise. I let my body go limp. I allowed my left eyelid to droop and let my mouth hang slack. I let my left arm slide off the mattress and dangle dead weight. When the security guards lifted me into the wheelchair, I did not help them. I dragged my left leg like it was made of wood. Where home? I slurred intentionally, letting a line of drool escape the corner of my mouth. Veronica watched me closely, her eyes scanning for any sign of deception. She saw a broken old man whose brain had finally snapped under the trauma of the crash and the drugs. The tension in her shoulders relaxed. She smiled that cruel, shark-like smile. "Bring him home then," she said, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "It looks like the crash caused a stroke. He is a vegetable now. He won't be a problem anymore." They wheeled me out to the car. I kept up the act, staring blankly at the rain. They thought they were bringing a helpless invalid back to the mansion. They did not know they were carrying a Trojan horse right through the front gates. I was back inside, and this time I was invisible. Duide là nội dung chi tiết cho đoạn Wipon được viết bằng tiếng Anh tối ưu hóa cho dòng đọc AI, không tiêu đề, không ký tự đặc biệt, tập trung vào xung đột và cú twist về đứa con. They dumped me onto the narrow mattress in the servants' quarters like a sack of unwanted laundry. I lay there with my mouth slightly open and my eyes fixed on a water stain on the ceiling. I had to maintain the illusion of a stroke victim perfectly because I knew Veronica was watching. She stood over me holding a long silver sewing needle she had pulled from a repair kit. "Let us see if anyone is actually home," she whispered. Without a shred of hesitation, she drove the metal tip deep into the soft arch of my right foot. The pain was sharp and white-hot like a hornet sting magnified 10 times. My body wanted to jerk. My throat wanted to scream. But I went to a place in my mind that I hadn't visited since 1971 in the jungle. I locked my muscles. I disconnected my brain from my nerves. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I did not even blink. Veronica pulled the needle out and wiped a drop of my blood on the sheet. She laughed a cold, satisfied sound. "He is gone," she announced to the empty room. "The lights are on, but nobody is home." She walked to the door and whistled. Dr. Ellis walked in, loosening his tie. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and amusement. "Are you sure he is out?" Ellis asked, nudging my bed with his knee. "I just stabbed him, and he did not move a muscle," Veronica said, wrapping her arms around the doctor's neck. "He is a vegetable, Ellis, a drooling, brain-dead vegetable. We can do whatever we want right in front of him, and he won't remember a thing." To prove her point, she kissed him. A long, passionate kiss right there in the room where my brother used to sleep. It was the ultimate disrespect. They were not just killing our family line, they were dancing on its grave. Ellis pushed her back slightly onto the edge of my bed. The mattress shifted under their weight. I stared blankly ahead, forcing my breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic, even as rage boiled in my gut. "We need to be careful," Veronica Ellis murmured between kisses. "If Brandon finds out about us, he will cut the funding. We need him to sign the final release forms for the estate transfer on Friday." Veronica laughed, stroking the doctor's hair. "Brandon will do whatever I tell him to do. He is weak, Ellis. He is nothing like you. Besides, he is so happy about becoming a father, he would sign his own death warrant if I asked him to." Ellis paused, his hand resting on her stomach. "About that, are you sure the timing works? If he does the math." "He won't do the math." Veronica interrupted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He thinks he is the father, Ellis. He thinks this is the Carter heir. But you and I know better, don't we?" My heart stopped beating for a second. "This baby is pure you," Veronica said, pulling Ellis closer. "It is our insurance policy. Once Brandon signs the estate over to the child, we will be the legal guardians of an $18 million fortune. And then Brandon can have a tragic accident just like his father and his uncle. I lay there paralyzed by choice and by horror. The child was not my grandson. It was the spawn of the man who murdered my brother. Brandon was not just a pawn, he was the next victim. They were going to kill my son as soon as the ink was dry. I knew then that I could not just expose them. I had to destroy them. It was 3 a.m. when the door handle turned. I lay perfectly still, letting my breath hitch in a rhythmic rattle like a dying man. The room smelled of mildew and old dust, but the scent that drifted in was far stronger. It was stale scotch and fear. It was Brandon. He collapsed into the wooden chair beside my bed, burying his face in his hands. He was weeping. Not the fake tears Veronica shed at the funeral, but the ugly sobbing of a man who knows he is ruined. "I am sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never wanted this. It was just supposed to be the money, the gambling debt. $450,000, Dad. The bookies said they would break my legs. They said they would come for the house." He looked at my motionless face, thinking I was too far gone to hear him. Veronica said it would be easy, he continued, wiping his nose on his sleeve. She said Uncle Edward would just go to sleep and we would pay off the debt and start over. But she went too far. And now she says you have to go too. She says we cannot risk you waking up. He reached out and took my hand. His palm was clammy and shaking. "I am a coward, Dad. I am so sorry." I decided right then that my son was not evil, just pathetically weak, and weakness could be managed. I tightened my grip. Brandon tried to pull his hand away, thinking it was a muscle spasm, but I clamped my fingers around his wrist with the crushing strength of a man who had built skyscrapers with his bare hands. I opened my eyes. I turned my head and looked him dead in the face. "Quiet," I hissed. Brandon gasped, stumbling back and knocking the chair over. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Dad, you are awake." I sat up slowly, ignoring the stiffness in my joints. "I am not just awake, Brandon. I am the only thing standing between you and a prison cell." He started to hyperventilate. "I have to tell Veronica. I have to. If you leave this room, I will scream." I interrupted, my voice low and dangerous. "I will scream that you confessed to murdering Edward. I have the recordings, Brandon. I have the evidence. And do you think Veronica will go to jail for you? She will throw you to the wolves to save herself." Brandon sank to his knees beside the bed, shaking uncontrollably. "She is going to kill me, Dad. If I do not do what she says about the estate transfer, she will kill me." "She is going to kill you anyway," I said, grabbing his chin and forcing him to look at me. "You are a loose end. Once you sign those papers, you are worth more to her dead than alive, just like Edward was." I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. He knew I was right. He knew his wife was a monster. "Help me, Dad," he whimpered. "Please, what do I do?" I leaned in close. "You are going to prove whose son you are. Tomorrow morning, Veronica always prepares a fresh glass of orange juice for herself and one for me. She puts a powder in mine. I have seen her do it." I paused, letting the weight of the order sink in. "Tomorrow, when she turns her back to put the pitcher in the fridge, you are going to switch the glasses. You are going to give her the glass she meant for me." Brandon's eyes went wide. "But that will save your life," I cut him off. "Do not ask questions. Just do it. If you want to live to see another birthday, you will make sure she drinks from that glass. Now get out of here and dry your eyes." The show starts at breakfast. I listened intently to the sounds coming from the kitchen down the hall, waiting for the clinking of glass that would signal Brandon was following my orders. My heart was pounding against my ribs. This was the moment that would decide if my son was a man or a mouse. I had given him a chance to redeem himself, to save his soul by switching the poisoned orange juice. All he had to do was choose his father over the woman who was turning him into a killer. But then I heard sobbing. It was low and pathetic, drifting through the thin walls. "I cannot do it, V," Brandon whimpered. "I cannot do this anymore. We are going to get caught." I closed my eyes. He was not switching the glasses. He was confessing. Veronica's voice cut through his sobbing like a razor blade. She did not sound scared. She sounded annoyed. "Get a hold of yourself, Brandon. We are days away from $18.5 million. Do you know what that buys? It buys a penthouse in Monaco overlooking the harbor. It buys that yacht you have been drooling over in magazines since you were 12. It buys your freedom from those loan sharks who want to break your legs." "But Dad," Brandon stammered. "Dad is a vegetable." Veronica interrupted, her voice dripping with venom. "He is a piece of furniture, Brandon. He does not feel pain. He does not have dreams. He is just an obstacle standing between you and a life of absolute luxury. Do you want to go back to being a broke loser begging for scraps, or do you want to be a king in Europe?" There was a long silence. The air in the house felt heavy with the weight of his decision. I prayed silently, begging him to find a spine. "He is not a vegetable," Brandon blurted out. My blood froze. "What are you talking about?" Veronica asked, her tone shifting from seductive to sharp. "He is awake, V," Brandon cried, his voice rising in hysteria. "He grabbed my arm last night. He spoke to me. He knows everything. He told me to switch the glasses. He wants me to poison you." I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a cold emptiness spread through my chest. My own son had just signed my death warrant to save his own skin. He had sold me out for a fantasy of Monaco that would never happen. The silence that followed was terrifying. It lasted for 10 seconds. Then I heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. They were not the shuffling steps of my son. They were the rhythmic, confident clicks of high heels followed by a dragging sound. Something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The door to my room flew open. Veronica stood there. She was not holding a tray of food. She was holding a wooden baseball bat Edward used to keep behind the bar for protection. Her face was no longer masking her true nature. Her eyes were wide with a manic rage, and her lips were pulled back in a snarl. Behind her, Brandon stood cowering in the hallway, unable to look at me. "So the vegetable can talk," Veronica said, stepping into the room and closing the door with her foot. She slapped the bat into her open palm with a sickening crack. "You should have stayed asleep, Bill," she whispered, raising the bat. "Because now I have to make sure you never wake up again, and this time I am going to enjoy it." The baseball bat came whistling down toward my skull with enough force to shatter bone. In that split second, the frail invalid named William Carter ceased to exist. In his place was Sergeant Carter of the 101st Airborne. I rolled off the mattress with a fluidity that defied my 72 years. The ashwood bat smashed into the pillow where my head had been a second ago, exploding in a cloud of goose feathers. Veronica screamed in frustration, pulling the bat free for another swing. But she had lost the element of surprise. Before she could raise the weapon above her shoulder, I lunged forward. I did not strike her. I swept my leg low and hard in a perfect tactical takedown, catching her ankles. She went down like a sack of cement, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. The bat skittered across the room. Brandon stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the sudden violence. He looked from his wife writhing on the floor to his father standing tall and ready. He took a step forward, his hands shaking. "Dad, stop," he stammered. I pointed a finger at him, my eyes cold. "Stay back, Brandon. You chose your side." Veronica scrambled backward, clawing at the carpet, her face twisted into a mask of pure demonic rage. "Security," she shrieked, her voice piercing the walls. "Kill him! Get in here and kill him!" I heard the heavy thud of combat boots sprinting down the hallway. The Titan security goons were coming. I kicked the bedroom door shut right in Brandon's face and threw the heavy deadbolt. A second later, a shoulder slammed against the wood from the other side, cracking the frame. I did not waste a second. I dropped to my knees and reached under the bed. Duct-taped to the slats of the frame was a waterproof duffel bag I had prepared 3 days ago. I ripped it free. Inside was a flashlight, a hunting knife I had stolen from the kitchen, and a burner phone. "Open this door, old man," a deep voice bellowed from the hallway, followed by the terrifying sound of a shotgun racking a shell. I grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the nightstand and swung it into the window pane. Glass shattered outward into the stormy night. The wind and rain rushed in, instantly soaking me to the bone. Behind me, the bedroom door splintered. Wood chips flew across the room. A black-gloved hand reached through the hole trying to find the lock. I threw the bag out into the darkness and vaulted onto the windowsill. I took one last look at Veronica, who was now standing up, holding her stomach, and laughing maniacally. "Run, William, run," she taunted. "The dogs are hungry tonight." I jumped. I landed hard in the muddy flower bed, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through my bad shoulder, but I ignored it. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my bag, and sprinted toward the dense tree line that marked the edge of the estate. Behind me, I heard the window shatter completely as the guards opened fire. Bullets chewed up the mud around my feet, but I was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The game of cat and mouse had just turned into a war. The forest behind the estate was a nightmare of twisting roots and freezing rain. The downpour was torrential, soaking my clothes instantly and turning the ground into a slick, treacherous mudslide. It felt exactly like the day we buried Edward in the cemetery. Only now the water running down my face was not grief, but survival. My lungs burned with every breath, and my bad shoulder throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. But I pushed the pain aside. I could hear them behind me, the deep guttural barking of attack dogs echoing through the trees. Veronica had released the hounds. I scrambled up a steep embankment, slipping and clawing at the wet earth. I knew I could not outrun a German shepherd, and I certainly could not fight 2 armed mercenaries in a foot race. I had to use the one weapon they did not have: my knowledge of this land and the laws of physics. I reached the perimeter fence where the old security lighting system was installed. Edward and I had wired this grid ourselves 30 years ago. I knew exactly where the junction box was. I pulled the hunting knife from my bag and pried the rusted cover open. Inside, the wires were humming with 220 volts of electricity. I looked back. The flashlight beams of the guards were cutting through the darkness, getting closer. I could hear their boots splashing through the puddles. I made a split-second calculation. I slashed the insulation on the main power feed, exposing the raw copper wire. Then I kicked the heavy cable down so it dangled directly into a large depression in the mud that was rapidly filling with rainwater. It was a crude trap, but effective. I scrambled up a nearby oak tree, dragging my aching body onto a low branch just as the first dog burst into the clearing. The dog stopped sniffing the air, confused by the scent of ozone. 2 guards emerged from the brush, breathing hard, their weapons raised. They did not see the wire. They only saw the empty path ahead. "Clear left," one shouted, stepping forward. He stepped right into the puddle. The effect was instantaneous. The moment his boot made contact with the electrified water, the circuit closed. Blue sparks arc up his leg, and he stiffened, letting out a strangled cry as the current seized every muscle in his body. The second guard instinctively reached out to grab his falling partner, and the current jumped to him too. They both collapsed into the mud, twitching uncontrollably as the smell of burnt rubber filled the air. I did not stay to watch. I dropped from the tree and sprinted the last 100 yards to the highway. The sounds of the storm masked my footsteps. I burst out of the tree line and onto the asphalt just as a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A black Lincoln town car screeched to a halt in front of me. The back door flew open. Mr. Hastings sat inside, calm as a statue amidst the chaos. "Get in, William," he said, holding the door open. "I told you I never lose a client." I dove into the leather back seat, gasping for air as the car sped away, leaving the estate and its monsters disappearing in the rearview mirror. I was battered, bleeding, and exhausted, but I was free, and I was ready to end this. The safe house was a windowless apartment in the basement of a high-rise in downtown Seattle. It smelled of bleach and canned air. There were no luxuries here, just a cot, a metal table, and a high-end computer rig with satellite encryption. Hastings locked the steel door behind us and engaged 3 separate deadbolts. For the first time in 48 hours, I stopped looking over my shoulder. I collapsed onto the cot, shivering in my wet clothes. My body was screaming in protest. The adrenaline that had carried me through the forest was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion. But I could not rest yet. I had one more painful task to complete. "I need a bucket," I croaked, holding my stomach. Hastings did not ask questions. He grabbed a metal basin from under the sink and handed it to me. He turned his back out of respect, giving me a moment of privacy. I leaned over the basin, forcing my gag reflex, triggering the spasms my body was desperate to reject. It was violent and agonizing. My throat burned with acid and bile. Finally, with a wet heave, I heard the distinct clink of hard plastic hitting the metal. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. "I am sorry about that," I said, my voice raspy. Hastings handed me a bottle of water and a pair of tweezers. He picked up the small biohazard bag containing the tiny nanodrive I had just regurgitated. He washed it in the sink with rubbing alcohol, drying it carefully with a lint-free cloth. His face was a mask of grim concentration. "Let us see if it survived the trip," he said. He plugged the drive into the computer tower. We both held our breath. The screen flickered, then a folder icon appeared. Hastings clicked it. Files cascaded down the screen. Photos of the arsenic delivery. Audio recordings of Veronica threatening Dr. Ellis. Bank transfers showing the payoffs to the Titan security guards. It was all there. A complete digital roadmap of a conspiracy to commit murder. Hastings sat back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "This is it, William. This is a slam dunk. We have enough here to put Veronica and Dr. Ellis away for life without parole. We can even get Brandon on accessory charges." He reached for the secure landline on the desk. "I am calling the district attorney. We can have a SWAT team at the estate within the hour. We can end this tonight." I reached out and placed my hand over his, stopping him from lifting the receiver. "No," I said. Hastings looked at me confused. "William, this is evidence of capital murder. Every second they are free is a risk. Why would you wait?" I looked at the glowing screen, at the faces of the people who had killed my brother and tried to kill me. "If we call the police now, they get lawyers. They get bail hearings. They get to spin the story in the press. Veronica will claim she was coerced. She will lie. She will fight." I stood up, ignoring the pain in my ribs. "Tomorrow morning is the official reading of Edwards." Well, I said, my voice steady and cold. "The entire family will be there. The business partners. The cousins who never visited but want a check. Even the press might be there because of Edwards' high profile. I want them to think they won Hastings. I want Veronica to sit in that chair, believing she owns the world. I want her to feel the victory. And then I want to rip it away from her in front of everyone she has ever tried to impress. I do not just want justice. I want humiliation." Hastings looked at me for a long moment, studying the hard set of my jaw. Slowly, he took his hand off the phone. A small, dark smile touched his lips. "Very well, William," he said. "The reading is at 9 a.m. We better get you a suit. You cannot come back from the dead looking like that." Hastings handed me the burner phone. It felt heavy in my hand, like a grenade with the pin pulled. It was time to set the trap. If I just showed up tomorrow unannounced, they might panic and flee, or worse, they might start shooting before I even got through the door. I needed them calm. I needed them arrogant. I needed them to believe they had already won. I dialed Brandon his number. He picked up on the first ring. "Dad, where are you?" He was screaming, but his voice was thin and brittle, cracking with hysteria. Veronica is tearing the house apart. She has the guards sweeping the woods. She says if we find you, she is going to finish what she started. I took a deep breath and let my shoulders slump, forcing my voice to tremble. I channeled every ounce of exhaustion and fear I had felt over the last 3 days. "I am tired, son," I whispered into the phone. "I am so tired. I cannot run anymore, Brandon. I am cold, and my chest hurts." I think I pushed myself too hard. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear Brandon breathing fast. "Where are you, Dad? Tell me and I will come get you." "No," I said quickly. "I am safe for tonight. I am at a motel off the interstate. But I am done fighting Brandon. Tell Veronica she wins. Tell her I will sign the papers. I will sign the estate over to the baby. I just want this to stop." "You mean it?" Brandon asked, hope flooding his voice. "You will sign the waiver?" "Yes," I lied. "But I will only do it tomorrow at the official reading. I want Mr. Hastings to witness it so it is legal. Tell Veronica to be there at 9 a.m. sharp. Tell Dr. Ellis to be there too. I want everyone to see that I am stepping aside peacefully. Just promise me she won't hurt me." "I promise, Dad." Brandon sobbed. "I promise. Just come home. We can be a family again." I hung up the phone. I looked at Hastings. "They took the bait," I said. "They will be there." Hastings nodded grimly. "Then you need to look the part. Look. You cannot walk in there looking like a fugitive." He pointed to a garment bag hanging on the back of the door. I unzipped it. Inside was a charcoal gray bespoke Italian suit. It was Edward's. He kept a spare wardrobe at the firm for emergencies. I touched the fabric. It was soft and expensive, the kind of armor a man wears when he controls the world. I went into the small bathroom and turned on the hot water. Steam filled the air, fogging up the mirror. I looked at my reflection. My face was bruised, my hair was matted with mud, and my eyes were haunted. I looked like a victim. I grabbed a razor and shaving cream. With every stroke of the blade, I scraped away the helpless old man. I scraped away the invalid who spilled soup. I scraped away the terrified father who hid in the woods. I washed my face with freezing cold water and slicked my gray hair back. I stepped out and put on the suit. The white shirt was crisp and starched. The silk tie was blood red. The jacket fit me perfectly across the shoulders. I buttoned it up and felt a transformation take hold. I was no longer William, the retired engineer living on a pension. I was a Carter. I walked back to the mirror and adjusted my cuffs. The man staring back at me was not afraid. He was cold. He was calculating. He was dangerous. Hastings stood by the door, checking his watch. "The car is ready, William. Are you ready?" I straightened my tie one last time and looked at my own reflection with a steely resolve. "The sheep is gone," I said quietly. "It is time to go hunting." The grand living room of the Carter estate had been transformed into a theater of greed. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the morning sun, casting a golden gloom over the gathered assembly. It was a room where my brother Edward had once discussed architecture and charity, but today it smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The room was packed, not just with the immediate family, but with the extended clan. Cousins I had not seen in 20 years. An aunt who had borrowed $10,000 from Edward in 1995 and never paid it back. They were all there, circling the buffet table like vultures waiting for the carcass to be carved. At the center of it all stood Veronica. She was radiant in a black dress that was cut too low for a memorial gathering, and she held a crystal flute of champagne despite the early hour. She looked like a queen holding court. Beside her, Dr. Ellis sat nervously on the edge of the sofa, tapping his foot while Brandon paced back and forth near the window, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He looked pale and nauseous, knowing that he was waiting for his father to arrive, and sign away his life. Veronica clapped her hands, demanding silence. The murmur of the greedy relatives died down instantly. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Veronica announced, her voice projecting with practiced confidence. "I know this is a difficult time. Edward passing was tragic and sudden. And as many of you know, poor William is not doing well. The accident yesterday took a terrible toll on his already failing mind." She paused to let out a theatrical sigh, touching her hand to her chest. However, before his decline, William agreed that the burden of managing this estate is too much for him. He has agreed to waive his rights as executor. Therefore, according to the addendum Edward signed just before he died, I am to be the sole trustee of the Carter fortune until my unborn son comes of age. A ripple of shock and jealousy went through the room. The cousins whispered furiously. They had hoped for a payout, not a dictator. "But surely there is a reading," Uncle Bob shouted from the back. "We have rights." "You have nothing," Veronica snapped, her mask slipping for a second. "This is ironclad. We are just waiting for William to arrive and sign the formal waiver, then you can all go home." As if on cue, the grandfather clock in the hall began to chime 9 times. The deep, resonant bong echoed through the house. On the final stroke, the heavy double oak doors to the living room were thrown open with a force that rattled the windows. The room went deadly silent. I stepped across the threshold. I was not the invalid in the wheelchair they expected. I was not the muddy fugitive shivering in the rain. I was clean-shaven. I was standing tall. I was wearing Edward's charcoal Italian suit, and it fit me like armor. I walked with the steady, purposeful stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Gasps filled the room. Brandon dropped his coffee cup, shattering it on the floor. Veronica's mouth fell open, her champagne glass tilting dangerously in her hand. Behind me walked Mr. Hastings carrying a leather briefcase, and beside him walked a large man in a slightly ill-fitting brown suit. To the family, he looked like a bodyguard or a driver. But I knew him as Chief Miller, the head of the county police force, and he was not here for the buffet. I walked straight to the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Veronica. I looked her in the eye and saw the fear begin to crack her porcelain veneer. "I am here to sign Veronica," I said, my voice calm and booming. "But I think you are reading from the wrong script." Veronica regained her composure faster than I expected. She was a predator, and predators do not like being cornered, especially in front of an audience. She smoothed the front of her dress and forced a tight, condescending smile onto her face. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal paper. She slammed it onto the coffee table with a thud that silenced the whispering relatives. "You can play dress-up all you want, William," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But it does not change the facts. This is the last will and testament of Edward Carter, dated 3 days before his passing. It supersedes everything else. It grants full control of the estate to me." She pointed a manicured finger at the bottom of the page. "Look at the signature. It is shaky, yes, because he was weak, but it is his." He signed it right there in that bed, while Brandon and I held his hand. I walked over to the table and looked down at the paper. The signature was a scrawl barely legible, but it did bear a resemblance to my brother's handwriting. It was a good forgery. But they had made one fatal error, an error born of their own cruelty. I started to laugh. It was a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "What is so funny?" Old man Veronica snapped, her eyes narrowing. I picked up the document and held it up for the room to see. I looked directly at Dr. Ellis, who was now sweating profusely on the sofa. "The date on this will is October 15th, I said, my voice steady and loud. I turned to the doctor. "Tell me, Dr. Ellis, what are the side effects of advanced digoxin toxicity, specifically when the patient has been given 3 times the lethal dose?" Ellis went pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I will tell you," I continued, walking toward him. "It causes severe neuropathy, nerve damage, paralysis. On October 15th, Edward could not feel his fingers. He could not hold a spoon to feed himself soup, let alone hold a heavy fountain pen to sign a complex legal document. His right arm was dead weight, Dr. Ellis. You know this because you noted it in his medical chart, which you tried to hide. I threw the document back onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and fell to the floor at Brandon's feet. You forged the signature of a man who was physically incapable of writing, I declared. That document is not a will. It is a confession of fraud. Liar, Veronica shrieked, losing her composure completely. She lunged forward, but Brandon grabbed her arm, holding her back. He was shaking, looking at the document on the floor, as if it were a poisonous snake. That is impossible, Brandon whispered. You said he signed it. You said you saw him sign it. I lied, you idiot, Veronica hissed at him, but the damage was done. The room was buzzing. The relatives were backing away from her. The illusion of her power was shattering. Mr. Hastings stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the table. He clicked the latches open. The sound was like 2 gunshots in the silence. Paper can be forged, Hastings said, his voice cutting through the noise. Witnesses can be bought. But Edward knew that. That is why he did not leave a paper will. Hastings pulled out a laptop and turned it to face the room. He connected it to the large television screen mounted above the fireplace. He left this. The static on the massive 60-inch television screen hissed for a second, sending a shiver through the room. Then the image cleared. A collective gasp swept through the crowd of greedy relatives like a sudden draft. There, sitting in his leather armchair wearing his favorite cardigan, was my brother Edward. He looked frail, his skin pale and papery, but his eyes were blazing with an intensity that death had not extinguished. The video was dated October 14th, just 2 days before he died. He leaned forward toward the camera lens. It felt like he was looking right out of the screen and staring directly into our souls. Hello, Veronica, Edward said, his voice raspy but clear. If you are watching this, it means I am dead. And if I am dead, it means you and Dr. Ellis finally succeeded. Veronica let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a scream. Her face went completely white, draining of all color, until she looked like a wax statue. She stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the sofa for support. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, but no one looked down. Every pair of eyes was glued to the dead man, speaking from the grave. I know about the pills, Edward continued on the screen, holding up a small orange bottle. I know about the arsenic you ordered under your maiden name. You thought I was sleeping when you discussed the dosages with the doctor, but I was just waiting. I was waiting to see if my son Brandon would step in and save me. On the screen, Edward paused, wiping a tear from his cheek. But he never did. In the living room, Brandon let out a low moan, dropping his head into his hands. Dr. Ellis suddenly jumped up from the sofa. His face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were darting around like a trapped animal. I am not listening to this, he yelled, his voice cracking. This is deepfake technology. This is illegal. I am leaving. He bolted toward the French doors leading to the patio. He moved fast for a man of his size, desperate to escape the judgment coming from the screen. But he did not make it 3 steps. The large man in the brown suit, who had arrived with us, Chief Miller, stepped into his path with the speed of a linebacker. He did not say a word. He just placed a massive hand on the doctor's chest and shoved him back onto the sofa with enough force to rattle the frame. Sit down, Miller growled. The show is not over. On the screen, Edward leaned back, looking tired but resolute. Because of your betrayal, Veronica, and because of your complicity, Brandon, I am invoking the morality clause of the Carter Family Trust. You get nothing. Not the house, not the money, not even the cars you leased in my name. He took a deep breath. I leave my entire estate, including the $18.5 million in liquid assets, the property portfolio, and the control of the charitable foundation, to the only man who remained loyal to me. I leave it all to my brother, William Carter. The screen faded to black, but Edward's final words hung in the air like smoke. He had commanded me from the grave not just to inherit his wealth, but to weaponize it. The room was deathly quiet until the sound of sobbing broke the silence. It was Brandon, my son. The boy I had taught to ride a bike and to fish was now a grown man kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, clutching the hem of my jacket like a frightened child. "Dad, please, Brandon," wept, his face streaked with tears and snot. "You have to understand. I was forced into this. Veronica threatened to leave me. She said she would take the house and the baby. I did not want Uncle Edward to die. I was just scared, Dad. I am a victim here too." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for salvation. He thought that because I was his father, I would melt. He thought that the bond of blood was stronger than the sin of murder. But I looked down at him, and I did not see my son. I saw the man who had watched me eat poisoned soup and done nothing. I saw the man who had called me in the woods to lure me into a trap. "Get up, Brandon," I said, my voice cold and hard as granite. "You are embarrassing yourself." "But the baby," Brandon stammered, scrambling to his feet, but still holding on to my arm. "Think of your grandson, Dad. Veronica is pregnant. That is the future of the Carter name. Even if you hate me, you cannot punish an innocent child. We need the money to raise him." I looked over at Veronica. She was standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, but her eyes were darting around the room, calculating her next move. She knew the walls were closing in, but she still thought she had one card left to play: the heir. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit. I pulled out a folded piece of paper that Hastings had printed from the decrypted files just an hour ago. It was a paternity test report from a private clinic in Switzerland, dated 2 months ago. Veronica had tried to delete it, but Edward's investigator, Blackwood, had recovered it from the cloud. I slapped the paper into Brandon. His chest. "You are crying over a ghost, Brandon," I said quietly. He looked at the paper, confused. "What is this?" "Read it," I commanded. "Read the results." Brandon's eyes scanned the document. His brow furrowed. Then his eyes went wide. He stopped breathing. He looked from the paper to Veronica, then back to the paper. "Subject, fetus." He read, his voice trembling. "Paternity match, 99.9%. Biological father, Dr. Samuel Ellis." The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than the silence of death. Brandon looked at Dr. Ellis, who was shrinking back into the sofa cushions, wishing he could disappear. Then he looked at Veronica, the woman he had killed for, the woman he had betrayed his own father for. "It is not yours, Brandon," I said, delivering the final blow. "You were never going to be a father. You were just the bank account they needed to hijack the estate. You are not a husband to her. You are a cuckold and a patsy." Brandon made a sound I will never forget. It was a low, animalistic growl that started deep in his throat. The realization shattered whatever sanity he had left. The grief on his face vanished, replaced instantly by a pure, murderous rage. He dropped the paper. He did not look at me anymore. He turned slowly toward the doctor and his wife. The sound that came out of Brandon was not human. It was the howl of a wounded animal realizing it had chewed off its own leg for nothing. He dropped the DNA test and launched himself across the coffee table, scattering the crystal vases and legal documents. He collided with Dr. Ellis with the force of a linebacker. The sofa tipped over backward, sending both men crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and expensive fabric. "You dirty traitor," Brandon screamed, punching the doctor in the face repeatedly. "You slept in my house. You ate my food. You smiled at me while you impregnated my wife." Dr. Ellis tried to cover his head, shrieking for help, but Brandon was possessed by a demon of pure humiliation. He wasn't just hitting the doctor, he was trying to erase him. Blood sprayed onto the white rug. The relatives screamed and scrambled toward the walls, knocking over chairs in their haste to get away from the violence. Veronica tried to intervene. "Get off him, you idiot," she yelled, grabbing Brandon by the back of his suit jacket. "You are going to kill him." Brandon spun around. His face was unrecognizable, swollen with rage and streaked with tears. He shoved Veronica backward. She stumbled over her high heels and fell hard against the fireplace mantel. "You are next," Brandon roared, advancing on her. "You made me kill my own uncle for a lie. You made me try to kill my own father. You took everything from me." He reached for a heavy brass poker from the fireplace set. Veronica scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her face twisted in terrified disbelief. She had spent years manipulating this man, thinking he was a spineless puppet, but she had pushed him too far, and the puppet had cut its strings. I stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly still. I did not move to help. I did not look away. I watched with a cold detachment as the people who had plotted to murder me tore each other apart. It was a biblical scene of retribution. The snakes were finally eating their own tails. I felt no pity, only a grim satisfaction. This was the justice Edward had paid for with his life. Brandon raised the brass poker high above his head, ready to bring it down on the woman he once loved. "That is enough!" The voice boomed through the room, cutting through the screams. Chief Miller stepped forward from the shadows. He moved with deceptive speed for a big man. He grabbed Brandon's raised arm in midair, twisting it until the poker clattered to the floor. With his other hand, he pulled a gold badge from his jacket pocket and held it high. Police Miller announced, his voice commanding absolute authority. "Everyone freeze." He kicked Dr. Ellis, who was trying to crawl toward the door. "Stay down, Ellis." Two uniformed officers burst through the front door, guns drawn, securing the perimeter. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Brandon, heavy breathing, and Veronica whimpering near the fireplace. Chief Miller looked around the room, his eyes landing on each of the conspirators. "Brandon Carter." "Veronica Stone and Dr. Samuel Ellis," he said, taking out a pair of handcuffs. "You are all under arrest for the murder of Edward Carter, the attempted murder of William Carter, conspiracy to commit fraud, and grand larceny. The party is over." As the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around Veronica's wrists, the mask of the sophisticated high society wife dissolved completely. Gone was the grieving widow who lunched at the country club. Gone was the poised heiress who spoke of charity and grace. In her place stood the desperate, vicious street hustler she had always been beneath the layers of designer silk. She thrashed against the two uniformed officers, kicking her legs and screaming profanities that would make a sailor blush. Her face was contorted into an ugly snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred, and she spat in my direction, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth. "You think you won, you miserable old bastard?" she screamed, her voice raw and scratching against her throat. "You are nothing, William. You are just a placeholder. I ran this family. I kept this house standing. I will be out on bail by dinner, and I will burn this whole estate to the ground with you inside it. Do you hear me? I will finish the job myself." She tried to lunge at me, but the officers yanked her back roughly. She was no longer the lady of the manor. She was just a violent criminal in a cocktail dress. Across the room, Dr. Ellis was huddled in the corner with a detective weeping openly. The sight of the handcuffs had broken him instantly. He pointed a shaking finger at Veronica, desperate to save his own skin. It was her idea, he blubbered, his voice high and pathetic, echoing off the walls. She planned everything. She bought the arsenic online. She forced me to falsify the medical records. I just wanted to help the family. She threatened to expose my malpractice lawsuits if I did not help her kill Edward. She said she would ruin me. "Please, officer, I will testify. I will give you the emails, the texts, everything. Just do not put me in with the general population. It was all her." "You spineless rat!" Veronica shrieked, struggling against her restraints. "Shut your mouth, Ellis, or I will shut it for you." I watched them turn on each other with a grim satisfaction. The alliance built on greed had crumbled the moment the consequences arrived. I walked slowly toward Veronica. The room fell silent again, the relatives watching with bated breath. I signaled the officers to hold her steady. I stopped inches from her face. She was panting heavily, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks, looking wild and broken, but her eyes were still defiant. I leaned in close so only she could hear me. My voice was a whisper, but it hit her harder than a physical blow. You wanted this house so badly, didn't you, Veronica? You killed for it. You betrayed your husband for it. You slept with that coward over there just to secure your future in these rooms. I paused, looking around the grand foyer at the crystal chandelier and the marble floors she loved more than human life. Well, take a good look around, I whispered. Memorize it. Because the court is seizing the entire estate as a crime scene and as evidence of fraud. By the time the trial is over, it will be liquidated to pay for the damages. You will never step foot in this house again. It is not your palace anymore. It is just a pile of bricks, and you are homeless. Veronica's eyes went wide. For the first time, the reality of her loss truly hit her. She did not scream again. She just slumped in the officer's grip, staring at the floor as they dragged her out the heavy oak doors and into the back of a waiting squad car. The visiting room at the county jail smelled of industrial cleaner and stale sweat. It was a stark contrast to the mahogany and leather of the Carter estate. I sat on a bolted metal stool, staring at my reflection in the thick scratched plexiglass that separated the free from the condemned. 1 week had passed since the arrests. 1 week since I watched my family disintegrate. When the heavy steel door on the other side buzzed open, Brandon was led in by 2 guards. He looked terrible. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, and his face was gaunt, covered in patchy stubble. He had lost the arrogant shine of a man who thought he was inheriting millions. Now he just looked like a frightened boy who had broken a window and was waiting for his father to fix it. He sat down and snatched the receiver from the wall, pressing it to his ear with trembling hands. "Dad, thank God you came," he said, his voice cracking through the static of the phone line. "You have to get me out of here. The public defender is useless. He says the DA is going for 20 years. They set bail at $1 million. But you have Uncle Edward's money now, right? You can post it. You can get me out today." I picked up the phone slowly. I looked at my son. Even now, sitting in a cage facing decades in prison, he was still thinking about the money. He still thought the checkbook was the solution to every problem. "I am not posting bail, Brandon," I said quietly. Brandon blinked, confused. "What? What do you mean? You have $18 million. $1 million is nothing to you. I am your son, Dad. You cannot leave me in here. It is dangerous. There are gangs in here. I am scared." I leaned forward until my forehead was almost touching the glass. "You should be scared," I said. "You helped murder your own uncle. You watched your wife poison me and you did nothing. You are not a victim, Brandon. You are a criminal." Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "I told you I was forced. It was the debt, Dad. The $450,000. If I didn't pay, they were going to kill me." I looked at him with a mixture of pity and resolve. This was the hardest thing I had ever had to do, but I knew it was the only way to save his soul, even if I lost his love. "I am not saving you," I said, my voice steady and final, "because that is the only way you will ever learn to be a man. For 35 years, I cleaned up your messes. Edward cleaned up your messes. And look where it got us. Edward is dead, and I almost died." I stood up. Brandon started to panic, slamming his hand against the glass. "Dad, wait. What about the debt? What about the gambling sharks? They will find me in here. That $450,000 debt is your problem now," I said. "You can figure out how to handle it from inside your cell. Maybe without a safety net, you will finally learn the value of a dollar and the value of a life." I hung up the phone. "No, Dad." "Please," Brandon screamed, his voice muffled by the thick glass. "Do not walk away. Do not leave me here. I am sorry. I am sorry." I turned my back on him. I could hear him wailing, pounding his fists against the barrier, begging for a rescue that was never coming. I walked toward the exit, my heart heavy as lead, but my conscience clear. I was not abandoning my son. I was finally letting him grow up. The mahogany desk in Mr. Hastings' office was wide enough to land a small plane on, but right now it was covered in stacks of legal documents that represented $18.5 million. The air conditioner hummed softly, a stark contrast to the chaos of the last week. I sat in the leather guest chair holding a heavy fountain pen, hovering over the signature line of the final trust dissolutions. Hastings watched me over the rim of his spectacles, his expression a mix of professional admiration and personal disbelief. "Are you absolutely certain about this, William?" Hastings asked, his voice quiet. "This is generational wealth. It is enough to buy a private island, enough to ensure you never have to worry about a medical bill or rent payment for the rest of your life. You are giving it all away, every single cent." I looked at the numbers on the page. To anyone else, they looked like freedom, but to me, they looked like blood. This money had turned my son into a monster. It had turned my sister-in-law into a murderer. It was not a gift, it was a cancer, and I was cutting it out before it could kill me, too. I am sure I said, my voice steady. "I do not want it, Hastings. This money is cursed. It attracts wolves, and I am too old to fight them off anymore. I have my pension. I have my truck. That is enough for me." I looked down at the breakdown we had drafted. First, I said, pointing to the first clause, $5 million goes to the Veterans Support Fund. I know what it is like to come home from a war with nightmares and empty pockets. I want this money to help men who actually fought for something, unlike my son, who fought only for greed. Hastings nodded, making a tick mark on the page. "And the bulk of the estate?" $10 million to the Seattle Home for Orphans. I continued. Veronica tried to use a fake pregnancy to steal this fortune. She used the idea of a child as a weapon. I want to turn that around. I want this money to go to children who actually exist, children who have no one to fight for them. Let them have the start in life that Brandon threw away. "And the remainder?" Hastings asked, tapping the final paragraph. $3.5 million, I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. This is the most important part. I want to establish the Edward Carter Memorial Scholarship for architecture students. Edward built half this city, Hastings. He loved buildings. He loved creating things. I want his name to be remembered for what he built, not for how he died. I want his legacy to be creation, not destruction. Hastings took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. He looked at me with a soft smile. "Edward would have liked that, William. He would have liked that very much." I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed black and permanent. With a few strokes of my hand, I dismantled an empire. I signed away the mansion, the stocks, the bonds, and the art collection. I signed away the power that Veronica had killed for. When I put the pen down, I expected to feel regret. I expected to feel a sense of loss. Instead, I felt lighter than air. The weight was gone. I was poor again, but for the first time in weeks, I was clean. "It is done," I said, pushing the papers across the desk. "It is all gone." Hastings gathered the documents and placed them in a safe. "It is done," he agreed. "You are a free man, William." I stood up and buttoned my cheap jacket. I walked to the window and looked out at the city my brother loved. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds. It was a good day to start over. I had one final loose end to tie up before I could truly close the book on the Carter family tragedy. I had given away the fortune and dismantled the empire, but there was one specific item that gnawed at me. It was a symbol of Veronica's vanity, a testament to her greed that she had bragged about for months before Edward died. She had placed a non-refundable deposit on a custom Porsche 911 Turbo S in a screaming shade of cherry red. She had planned to pick it up the week after the funeral, using the insurance money she thought she was guaranteed to get. I walked into the dealership wearing my old windbreaker and worn-out sneakers. The salesman looked at me with skepticism, his eyes scanning my outfit and dismissing me as a window shopper. He was the same man who had fawned over Veronica when she ordered the car. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone dripping with polite condescension. I pointed to the red beast sitting in the showroom under the halogen lights. It looked fast, even when it was standing still. "I am here for the Carter order," I said, pulling out my checkbook. The salesman blinked. "Oh, Mrs. Carter. We have been trying to reach her. Her financing paperwork is incomplete. Is she coming in today?" I allowed myself a small, dry smile. "No, she is indisposed at the moment. She has been relocated to a state facility with very strict travel restrictions. I am William Carter, her father-in-law. I am taking over the contract." I did not use a dime of Edward's money for this. That money was blood money, and I had washed my hands of it. Instead, I emptied my own savings account. It was every penny I had scraped together from 40 years of engineering work and my military pension. It was reckless and foolish for a man my age to spend his life savings on a sports car, but this was not a purchase. It was a statement. I drove the Porsche off the lot. The engine roared like a lion, waking up a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the leather seat and into my spine. It was a magnificent machine. I merged onto the highway, and for a few miles I let myself feel the raw power of it. I pushed the pedal down and watched the world blur. But I was not heading home. I drove 40 miles south to the stark concrete complex of the Women's Correctional Facility. The prison looked like a gray scar on the landscape, surrounded by chain-link fences and razor wire. It was a place where dreams went to die. I pulled the bright red Porsche right up to the visitor parking lot, directly in front of the main entrance. The contrast was blinding. The gleaming cherry-red paint against the drab gray walls of the prison looked violent and beautiful. I rolled down the window and took out my phone. I snapped a high-resolution photo of the car with the prison guard towers clearly visible in the background. I stopped at the post office on the way back. I printed the photo and glued it to the front of a blank postcard. On the back, I took a black marker and wrote a message in clear block letters. The message was short. "The suspension is excellent, and the acceleration is breathtaking. Thank you for picking out such a wonderful color. It really turns heads. Do not worry, I will take good care of it while you are away. Thanks, daughter-in-law." I dropped the postcard into the mailbox. I knew the prison guards read every piece of mail before delivering it to the inmates. I imagined the look on Veronica's face when she sat in her cold concrete cell, eating gray mush, and held that glossy photo of her dream car, sitting just outside her cage. It was petty. It was vindictive. And as I revved the engine and drove away into the sunset, it was the most satisfying feeling I had ever known. I parked the bright red Porsche on the street below, nestled between a rusted pickup truck and a dented minivan. It looked ridiculous there, like a diamond sitting in a gutter, but I did not care. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, my knees popping with every step. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old carpet, a sharp contrast to the lavender and sandalwood scent of the Carter estate. But to me, this smell was sweeter than any perfume because it was the smell of honesty. I unlocked my door with a simple brass key. There were no electronic keypads here, no biometric scanners, no security guards pacing the perimeter. I stepped inside and the silence greeted me like an old friend. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the mansion where every shadow held a secret. This was a peaceful silence, It was the quiet of a life lived simply. I took off the expensive Italian suit jacket. It was a beautiful piece of tailoring, but it felt heavy on my shoulders, like a costume I had worn for a play that went on too long. I hung it carefully in the small closet next to my worn-out flannel shirts and my denim work jacket. I loosened the silk tie and threw it on the bed. I was done playing the role of the avenging tycoon. I was done being the detective, the spy, and the executioner. I was just William again. I walked into the small kitchenette where the linoleum was peeling at the corners. I opened the humming refrigerator. It was mostly empty save for a carton of milk, a few eggs, and a six-pack of cheap domestic beer. I pulled a bottle out and cracked it open. The hiss of the aluminum tab was the loudest sound in the room. I took a long, cold sip. It was bitter and watery and absolutely delicious. It tasted better than the vintage champagne Veronica had sipped while planning my murder. I dragged my old armchair over to the window and sat down. My bones ached. My ribs still throbbed from the crash, and my skin was still scratched from the run through the woods. But the pain was distant, now fading into the background. Outside, the rain had started to fall again, washing the city streets clean. I watched the headlights of the cars below blurring into streaks of red and yellow on the wet asphalt. People were going home to their families, to their dinners, to their small, safe lives. I raised the beer bottle slightly to the empty room, to the shadows in the corner, to the memory that had been haunting me for weeks. "Edward, can you hear me?" I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs completely for the first time since the funeral. I did it, brother. I burned the weeds out of the garden. I exposed the rot that was eating this family alive. The money is gone, Edward. I gave it all away just like we talked about when we were kids. It will build schools now. It will feed children. It will do good things, instead of poisoning the people who touch it. I looked at the reflection of my own tired face in the darkened window. The sharks are in cages, Edward. Veronica and the doctor, and even Brandon. They cannot hurt anyone ever again. I took back your name and I scrubbed the dirt off it. I cleaned up the trash, brother. The job is done. I took one last sip of the beer and set the bottle on the windowsill. My eyelids felt heavy. The adrenaline that had kept me moving was finally gone, leaving behind a profound and gentle exhaustion. I leaned my head back against the worn fabric of the chair and closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of the rain against the glass. Now I can finally sleep. The tragedy of the Carter family serves as a stark reminder that greed is a poison capable of eroding even the strongest bloodlines. While Veronica and Brandon chased the illusion of power through wealth, they ultimately lost their freedom and their humanity. William's journey teaches us that true legacy is not defined by the size of an inheritance, but by the strength of one's character. Integrity, courage, and a clear conscience are the only riches that cannot be stolen or taxed. In the end, a peaceful sleep in a humble room is worth far more than a restless night in a stolen palace. If you were in William's shoes, would you have given away the $18.5 million or kept it for yourself? Let us know in the comments below.